Now, you didn't know this, so I want to tell you in advance. There are here the two most enthusiastic people in the entire world. And you just heard from one of them. And the other one is sitting right here. He's Jim Deers, and he'll be talking with you tomorrow morning. So we're going to be so full, right, of enthusiasm that I can hardly stand it. Right? Tamarack is unique in the breadth and depth it has in Canada, across Canada. We have nothing like it in the United States. I come from Chicago. And so I'm always happy to be in any way associated with Tamarack. It's a Canadian jewel. Are there any people other than Jim here from the United States? Would you raise your hand? A couple back there. I just wanted to tell you before we went on the difference between the United States and Canada, if you haven't been here before. Canada is what the United States would be like if the United States were a reasonable place. Right? It's true. So, at any rate, we're here, I think, to think together about neighborhoods. And years and years ago, a friend of mine said to me, "Are you a neighbor or do you just live here?" And he said, "You're not a neighbor if you just live here. A neighbor is somebody who is connected to other people. And so if you're a resident or just live here, that's a problem. And the future is that you become a neighbor. And a neighborhood isn't a place. A neighborhood is a gathering that has a culture that calls forth the contributions of the gifts of the people who are there. So we're talking about neighborhoods, not a place in that traditional sense where people live. We're bounded in what we're thinking about, but it's all about people who are contributing together. So what I'd like to try to do in my time is 4 things, and that's a lot, so I'll probably rush through it a little. But I'd like to share with you what you already know. What are the basic building blocks that people use in neighborhoods to make the neighborhood better? And the second is, how can you identify those building blocks in your or others' neighborhoods? And the third is, if you know what the building blocks are, what can you build with them? What are the functions of a neighborhood that are special to the neighborhood? A place that has a special role. It has its own kind of work to do. What is that work? And the last is, how do you activate people in a neighborhood in ways that effectively relates them to the institutions around them? So we're going to try to see if we can walk pretty fast through those kind of questions. When I think about a neighborhood and its assets, what we're really thinking about is the building blocks that are there in the neighborhood. And we discovered the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, it's an ununderstandable idea, that when we would go around and talk to people in neighborhoods, there's a question that really opens up an understanding of what the building blocks are, and that is, can you tell us what people who live here have done together that has made things better? And believe it or not, we went over 4 years to 20 cities and 300 neighborhoods and knocked on doors and asked people that question. And we collected 3,000 plus stories about what people have done together, locally, to make things better. And then we said, well, let's take all the stories and ask ourselves, what did they use in those stories? Because a lot of these neighborhoods were called needy or problem neighborhoods, and if you looked at it from the outside, you'd think there was nothing there. But the story was showing you there was something there, and so what were they using to build the neighborhood? What were the basic building blocks? And I think the answer to that we called assets, but I want to focus today on the three basic human assets that appear in these stories when people make things better. Let's see if this is working. Oh, yes. So when we identified these assets, we decided not to make a list, but to make a map, because we're thinking about a neighborhood. So in your neighborhood, in my neighborhood, there are three kinds of human assets that are the basic building blocks for making things better. And this is the first one. Incidentally, we have a high-tech graphics center at Northwestern University that we consult with. And this is the first asset, and it is the gifts and the capacities of local residents, right? And the thing that's notable about that, I don't have it, but I usually have a glass half full or half empty, right? The half empty part is needs. The half full part is capacities or assets, right? And so what we learned is that nobody needs a need. You can't do anything with a need. So if you go to a neighborhood looking for needs, you come out with something you can't use. You can only use the full half. So anybody who is community building is necessarily focused on the full half. So that's the first asset, the gifts of local people. Second asset is that local people get together in all kinds of groups, clubs, and associations. And this is the graphic that tries to express that, these groups. And the key to note about them is that they are the way people magnify their gifts. They are the amplifiers of the gifts of local people. And these associations we found in the stories are probably the most important human building block. Because when we ask people, where did this whole initiative you're telling us about start? In a majority of cases, it started with associations. And by associations, I don't know whether this is going to work or not, but what we mean is groups like these. You can't see that in the back, can you? You can. Great. Well, then you get the idea. I don't want to waste a lot of time on it. But what's key is these are generally smaller face-to-face groups, and the members do the work, and they are not paid. With me? Now, they may have a paid member, an organizer, a secretary, a pastor, but basically they are the groups where the members do the work and they're not paid, and that's what Neighbours could be understood of in another way, right? So these are the kinds of groups that appear that people belong to in neighborhoods. And that's the second asset, the most important one in terms of initiating community improvement. And the third asset is groups of people in the neighborhood who come together, but they are paid. And they come together, and we call them businesses or for-profit groups and not-for-profit groups and government. And those are, we would say, institutions, not associations. And so we went over to the high-tech graphics center, and we said we want 3 graphics, one for not-for-profits, one for for-profits, and one for government. And we came back and they said, well, we didn't do 3, we did 1, because of 1 really shows you how much the 3 are really alike. And this is what they came up with. Right? A not-for-profit is usually organized that way. Business, the corporation is organized that way. Governments certainly are organized that way. And the thing that we really got clarified when we began to try to understand these building blocks is that institutions are like triangles, associations are like circles. And they are very different. And because they are different in form, they are also different in function. They're like 2 tools, right? One is a hammer, the other is a saw. So you wouldn't ask an institution to do what it can't do. It's a saw. We wouldn't say to the saw, would you put this nail in, right? So that we need to understand what is the difference between what systems can do and what associated people at the local level can do. They have different functions. We're going to talk a little more about what those functions are. But these are the 3 primary building blocks that appear in these stories. Now, I think we're going to focus on the first 2 because we know now that not-for-profits are not associations. Government is not associations, right? And business is not an association. We know what an association is. A smaller face-to-face group of people where the members do the work and they're not paid. And we're going to focus on associations and the gifts of individuals as the primary producer of the future. All right? They are the most productive of the assets. However, there's a problem about them. And I sort of discovered this years ago. My family all came from Ireland. And I love to go back to Ireland and go out in the west, little villages, and just rent a place for a week. And you know, there are 20 houses and 1 pub, 1 church, and 1 store. And so I was in one of these little houses with Marcia, my wife, and outside the town was a lake. And I love to fish, so I carry with me a rod and a reel, collapsible rod, all the time. I'll fish in that lake. But I didn't have any bait. So I went into town, walked down the street past 4 houses, and there was the store, right? And the store had a little path, there were some whitewashed rocks, and I walked up, and the door was open, and I walked in, and there was an old Irish gentleman, and he had, this kind of store had 3 cans of peas, 2 bags of coal, right? 1 battery. And so I said to him, "Sir, do you sell bait?" And he looked at me curiously, and he said, "Well, like, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, like worms." And he looked at me for a long time. And then he said to me, "Now, Sonny, when you walked up the path out there, did you notice that on each side there are 3 big whitewashed stones?" I turned around, I said, "Yes." He says, "I think if you just go out there and turn them over, you'll find all the worms you need." And that's how I learned that our primary assets of the gifts of individuals and associations are often unseen because there's a great stone over them, our institutions. We pay all our attention to institutions. We think the way you have a better life is you buy it from institutions. And so we don't see the primary assets very clearly, right? And so what I think I can share with you is, what would it be like if we saw clearly the gifts and the capacities of local people? We saw clearly their associations, because they are the principal building blocks. So how can we identify them? Now, I should say that a way of thinking about what's happened in the last generation is that maybe 50 to 70 years ago, this is the way the world looked in terms of power and function. The associative world, the neighborhood, was a producer of a lot of well-being, and the institutions were about their unique functions. But what has happened is this, that the institutions have eclipsed the associational and community, local community world. And so we are really faced with the difficult problem of how do we identify and then lift up once again the primary community building assets. And so we have spent a lot of our time in the last couple decades looking at how people go about the business, right, of lifting the stone up and saying, what's here in terms of the gifts and the capacities of local people? And I wanted to share with you, because I think this is sort of the front edge of community organizing, a way of approaching that, right? And so what I want to do is for you to imagine that you're living in your house and somebody comes to your door who's another neighbor, and they say they would like to sit down and talk with you and ask you a few questions. And these are, so I'm going to share these questions because I think this is the most effective way I have seen to date to really understand what's under the rock. So I'd like you to think for just a minute. We're going to have to move quickly as we do this. What is your most significant gift? And by gift, I mean something you were born with, not something that you learned. A gift is something you were given. My sister Kay was given a beautiful voice. I didn't get one. It's a gift. So, very quickly, think about your most significant gift. And in one and no more than 2 words, I'm going to go down and ask several of you so we can hear what the people think about this, right? You all got it? What is your most significant gift? Let me start here. Yours.
Mine, I would say, is the power of communication.
Communication. Yours, sir.
Jesus.
Jesus. That's good. That's good. That's good. Yours.
Organization.
Coordination. Yours.
Organization.
Organize.
Communication.
Communication. Yours.
Talking.
Talking. Yours.
Family.
Family. Okay. Now, supposing we did that with the whole room, and the room is our neighborhood, right? Supposing all of a sudden we knew what gifts surrounded us, right? This is the first transforming step to building community, right? Everybody here has a gift. Incidentally, the people who are organizing in this way find that on average, if you spend time with people, they will tell you 3 to 4 gifts, right? So if you began to say, you see those houses there? Most people here are not neighbors, but let's find out what their gifts are. Let's start there. And then we ask them, after they tell us their 4 gifts, we say, would you be willing to share these with your neighbors? And we now know that over 90% of the people you ask that question of will say yes. Okay, now we want to ask another question. What is your most significant skill? What have you learned to do that you do pretty well? Your most significant skill. Let me start in the back here. Give you just a second more to think about it. What is yours?
Public speaking.
Public speaking, wonderful.
Advocacy.
Advocacy. Yours.
The ability to learn.
Oh, wow.
Adaptable.
Oh my gosh. I don't know. I'm with him. You've been high-fiving this one.
Jesus.
I'd have to say advocacy as well.
Collaboration.
Collaboration. Now, what you're hearing here is something we know will happen. And that is often if you ask people their gifts or their skills, you have to go 20 to 40 people before you get a repetition. And what's that telling us? That's telling us that in those houses, those people have such a diversity of gifts and skills that we have here everything we need if we lift the rock. It's incredible what you learn. Now there's a third question that has become very popular to ask. And it is, what is your most significant passion? Something you care about so much that you have acted on it. What's your top passion? Mine is big band jazz. I travel all over the country to hear it, right? So let's ask here. Most significant passion?
My culture.
Culture. Her culture.
Music.
Music.
Gardening.
Gardening.
Oh gosh.
Economic justice.
Justice.
Art.
Skiing.
Now you see, all different, right? And they'll tell you 2 or 3, right? So look, we're making the community cake. First layer gifts, second layer skills, third layer passions. The top layer is, what do you know well enough that you could teach it to somebody else? Either an adult or a child. If you don't think you have something to teach an adult, you could. Do you have something you could teach a child, or vice versa, or both? So, what is the most significant thing you know that you think you could teach somebody else? And we're thinking neighborhood. They now have the idea. That's what we're talking about. They're going to share this with their neighbors. So, the most significant. Where shall I go? Where shall I go? Here. Let me start here. You.
How to communicate and express oneself.
How to express oneself.
Playing tennis.
How to play tennis.
How to share.
How to share.
Improvise at the piano.
How to improvise at the piano.
Play volleyball.
How to play volleyball. Now, can you imagine if we had that information from everybody in this room? Let's say, I don't know, we're 3 blocks of a place. That's about the number of people you find on 3 blocks, right? And we knew what they thought they could teach. And there are 200 people in this room. And on average, people will tell you 3 things they could teach, right? So 300 times 3 is 900. So we have a curriculum in this neighborhood of 900 topics. Across the street is a school. They got a curriculum of 16 topics. And the amazing thing is that we have ahead of us the development of educating communities, because in any 3 blocks, people know more that they could teach than any school teaches. So think of what we could add to the knowledge of a community, and above all, to begin to become a village that can raise a child. What is a village? How do you get a village? What does a village know? How can it raise a child? Right? So the last question, the last question I would ask you, but I can't do it, is what club, group, or association do you belong to? And you want to find that out, right? Because that tells you how this person is already connected. Right? And so can you each, we'll do this real quick. Can you think of a club, group, association that you belong to? And let me go down again. Let's just hear what a few people would say. Yes?
Community hub.
A community hub.
Squash. Squash club.
The squash club.
The cadet program.
The CAP program.
Tennis.
Tennis.
Local church.
The local church.
Children's Center.
A children's center.
Hamilton Regional Indian Center.
Indian center.
A church as well.
So what we know is that people are already associated in many, many ways. And in Prince George, you all know Prince George in British Columbia, city of 90,000 people. A group there called Project Friendship. You can find them on the internet. They're just a wonderful group. And they decided that the most important asset in Prince George was the clubs, groups, and associations. But they're invisible because there aren't lists of them like there are lists of businesses, right? And so they said, we've got to make our strongest community building resource visible. And this is it. They put out an annual directory to the association. Now, at the back, they have an index of the association. You see how tiny that print is? Right? There, I think, 60 on a page. This is the index to the associations in Prince George. Invisible, huh? Not in Prince George. They know they are the principal community building blocks, right? And there are here 1,150 associations. Wow. Now, these are just the ones that have names, because there's another 2,000, 3,000 that don't have names, of groups of people who get together, but they don't name themselves. So a community building initiative needs to make 2 things visible: the gifts, skills, passions, and teachables of the local residents and the associations to which they belong. Right? Now, let me share with you how this looks in one neighborhood. And this, let's hope it goes. This is a neighborhood which is a low-income neighborhood in Chicago. It's an African-American neighborhood. About the third of the people are unemployed. You got gangs. If you like needs, not want to do needs surveys, this place is a wonderful gold mine for you, right? All you needs needers. This is you can get rich off of this, right? But institutional people look at this neighborhood as though it's just full of needs, which of course they like because what they do is meet them. So it's the raw material for them, right? But they decided they were sick of that. And so they began having neighbors go and ask these questions that I just asked you. So here's how it looks this is the third lowest income of the 75 neighborhoods in Chicago. 20% of the people have any higher education. And this is what is there in 17 households. They started with 17 households, right? And these are the gifts of people in that neighborhood, in those 17 houses, but that's just half of them. There's the other half, right? Who knows that? There are millions of dollars being spent to try to find out what's wrong in the neighborhood. And nothing that says we start with the gifts and the capacities. So that's what we're about here. That's where we start. Now, what do they have in terms of skills? These are the kind of skills they say they have. All right? And passions. Incidentally, they have more passions than anything else. This is a passionate place. And then teachables. What could they teach? Okay. Now they asked the 40 kids in a youth at risk program if they wanted to learn any of these things. And these kids are on the way to dropping out. School will tell you they can't learn, right? But when they identified from this list what they wanted to learn, they changed. They met with neighbors who knew how to talk to them in ways that they could understand and were cared for. So the reconnection of adults to young people is perhaps the most significant of all community building activities. I was recently at a place, a county, where they have placed a moratorium on youth programs. No more, don't come to us, because you're going to get youth together in one more age segregated activity. If it were by race, you'd call it segregation. But what can we do to see the gifts of the kids, right? And connect them into the adult community, into the associations, and into the institutions. So the first thing is, what are the assets, right? And how do you identify them? And I'm sort of shorthanding the best I can do to share what we know about that. Now, I do want to give a plug for one of the workshops tomorrow afternoon. Because in Edmonton, perhaps the most advanced door-to-door organizing by neighbors around the kind of questions we're talking about is going on. They have 153 neighborhoods, and the city is supporting the notion, can't be done all at once, that this kind of community organizing will become central to what they're doing there. So if you want to learn about that, Howard, where are you? Howard Lawrence. Here, let's stand up so everybody can see you. There he is in the back. And the name of your workshop is? All right, the Abundant Community Initiative. So, if we've identified the assets, right, for community building, then I think it's useful to think about what is it that neighborhoods and their associations and their organizations that grow from the mobilization of these gifts and talents, what is it that they are especially able to do that big systems don't do very well? And incidentally, put this in this kind of, big systems are pulling back everywhere. I don't know whether you've noticed, right? And so there's a space being developed. So what we're thinking about is, how can we fill that space? And what is our unique functions? And looking at what people have come to invent and do, we can identify at least 7. So let me go over them quickly. What are the 7 special capacities of organized neighborhoods where the assets have been identified? The first is they are a primary contributor to the health of people, as measured by morbidity and mortality rates, if you want that. A guy who wrote a book in the United States called Bowling Alone, who's a Harvard political scientist who studied associations, and he says that if you have 2 men who are 65 years of age and paired in most important characteristics, but one of them belongs to one association and one belongs to none, statistically, belonging to one association will allow that man to live 2 years longer than the unassociated man. Now, why don't you go to your doctor and say, can you give me 2 extra years of life? The medical system can't touch it. But the community is the ultimate source of health. And all you people in health promotion who are here, you know that. So you have a very important role. That's the first one. Second is safety and security. Been a major study actually it was done in Chicago, but it was done by a Harvard sociologist. And over a long period of time, he compared blocks in various parts of the city in terms of how safe were they, as measured by the absence of the things you don't want, right? And then what correlates closest with it. And there are 2 things that are the best predictors of safety and security, and that is, how many names of people on the block do each of the people know? And number 2, how much public life is there on the block? That is, people who are not always in their house, who rip themselves away from American Idol or and actually come out on the porch, right? But those are the big predictors, right? And there's no question, every major police superintendent will say, we've done about everything we can do. You folks in the neighborhood, you have to get yourself in connection so that you bring a life and an organization to this place. The third is the environment, right? We're always talking about climate change and what systems ought to do. Listen, folks, the big environmental problem is me. Because how I heat myself, right? Or how much waste I generate, right? Or how much electricity I use, or how I decide to transport myself. that has, in aggregate on my block, we are the major determinants of climate change. But are we organized as the great climate changers? We would be if we had begun to understand the gifts we all have, right? And some people are going to say, I love the land, the garden, right? And I'm concerned about how we act in relationship to our beautiful land. The next one is the economy. We still know that the majority of jobs, I think, in Canada and the United States are in small businesses that are located largely in local places. So it's the job creator, and we still know that the majority of people get their jobs not on the internet and not in newspapers, but word of mouth. So if you're not connected on your block and you're unemployed, you have a low shot at getting employed. But if you were really connected with everybody, the word of mouth is the principal job identifier and authenticator in terms of the majority of people who get jobs. The next one is food. The local food movement isn't wonderful. Do you see it descending on us? It's just growing up all around us. And it is essential local function. And it deals with energy, which we're no longer wasting, bringing plums in January from Chile in airplanes to your supermarket, right? If we're producing food, we're saving energy. We are growing a local economy, and we are also improving health because now we're going to have some food that isn't based on poisoning them with herbicides and all that kind of stuff. And then the last two, I think, are the most important. We are uniquely able at the local level to raise children. Now, mostly we don't, because we've made a big mistake over the last 2 generations. We came to think that education was the responsibility of a school. And nobody who knows history ever had that idea at all. It is a nice, helpful part of education. And so we have now become associated with a group of localities that are creating what they call an educating community. They're saying every institution, every association, and every individual is an educator. Now, how do we create a board of education in which we mobilize all these assets and connect them to adults and to children? And I think that's the real future, especially for reintegrating young people into community life. I used to tell, when I was at the university, at the beginning of each class, I used to say, I hate students. As students are a false label that says you're becoming. You aren't. In this seminar, you are. And so, as we engage young people in productive activity, they are, not just waiting to 18. Right? And the last is care. If I want to know what people care about in a neighborhood, I ask them what associations they belong to. Because an association is held together by people who care about each other or who care about the same thing. And I don't ask them if they're working on the assembly line at Ford Motor, how much they care about that. Because I don't think that's where care is. Most of us vocationally are in a pretty careless situation. But care is the main result of the connections in local community. And we don't have youth problems. We have young people disconnected from our associations and from what we know and from what they can give us. The problem is disconnection of local assets, not the youth. It really misleads us to focus there. So that's a sort of a quick summary of what we are best able to do if we are organized around our capacities locally: health, safety, environment, economy, food, children, and care. Now, how would you activate so that those functions can take place, the local people? And I want to share with you 3 questions which I think are the most useful in thinking about this question. If we have these assets and they have these functions, how do we begin to think about mobilizing what we got to do the stuff we can uniquely do? And these 3 questions developed in an African American community in Sarasota, Florida, of all places. We found them there. And they said they got, every year they get people together, but they began, and they got all the people that they could from the neighborhood together, from all walks, and they sat them at tables of 8 and said, can you decide, make a list of all the things that would make things better here. Incidentally, they were heading off bitch and moan sessions. Boy, cities are always victims of setting up a situation where they're inviting people to come and bitch and moan at them, right? That's a failed strategy. But the question here was, what are the things that could be done in our neighborhood that could make things better? They had 250 options that were outlined, right? They eliminated about 100 who were duplicates. They had 150 different things that could be done to make the neighborhood better, all created from the minds and the vision of the local people. And the next week they came back on Saturday and they sat at tables that were, there would be a table for things that would be better about health or youth or economy. So there were about 7 different kinds of tables. You can sit whatever you want. But they had a sheet of paper, and let's say around youth things that could be done with and about youth that would make things better. Let's say they had 20 possibilities. And so they were asked for each of the possibilities to look at these 3 questions, were beside each. Can we do this activity with what we have where we are? We know our gifts and capacities. We know our associations. We have local institutions that are fairly responsive. So, how many of these 150 things can we do with what we have if we mobilize what we have? Second is, of the things that are left, which of those could we do with our assets if there were some outside institutional support that would go with it? Then we could do it. And the third is, what's left, things that we can't do with help, that it is the triangle's work. They can do it. And I can tell you that 52% of all the ideas of what would make the neighborhood better were assigned to the first category. And if you do this, it's magical. You have to do it that way. The first question can never be, what should the city do? What should the hospital do? You're dead in the water if you allow that question as first one. The first question is, what can we do together, right? And this group, this neighborhood, 5,000 people, 52% of the 150, they said they could do. Nobody had ever gotten them together from that city or all those agencies to find out what they could do. They were always gotten together to find out what the institutions could do to, for, and at them. So they had conceived themselves as producers of the future. And So for all of us who are institutional people, and I spent all too long in the university, God, that was a horrible experience. Because I started out as a neighborhood organizer, and I got lost at the university. But when we think about these three questions, and if you're thinking about how can we relate to communities, the three questions, I think, can guide your way. Because the second question makes very specific what you could do, businesses or agencies or government, with the local people to make things better. And the third question is the things that the people in the local neighborhood think you can do that they think are important to be done. Now, I don't know, all you folks who work for institutions or cities, wouldn't it be wonderful for a change if instead of people coming and bitching and moaning at you all the time, that what was happening is they said, you know, we've been going through a process of organizing ourselves for a year, and we've come to the place where we got a whole bunch of stuff we're doing with our assets. But here are 23 things that our assets are part of it, but we'd like you to become our partners in doing. Would you like to do that? And then here are 15 things we can't do, but we think they're really the most important things that you could be doing. So come join us. This is a real partnership. You see? People have the vision. People are producers. And institutions are supporters of their endeavors. That frees a city, I think, to understand yours. And Jim Deers, who's here tomorrow, is a guy who got into a city. He's an old neighborhood organizer like me. But he got into a city and showed him the way to begin to be the supporter rather than the controller, the dominator, or the program pusher, right? So he's really got a critical message. So, what are the assets? How do you identify them? What are their unique functions? And how do you mobilize them? At least there are a set of possibilities in all too brief a time. And I was thinking, what would be, here in Canada, the best way to conclude? And it's a story. But every story is how people know in neighborhoods. I went to university, and I'd be back in the neighborhood. Universities know by studies. Governments know by studies. Nobody in the neighborhood knows by studies. They know by stories. So it's the language of community, the story. So the story I wanted to share with you, because it's a Canadian story, is it used to be that the biggest gathering of community development organizations in Canada took place every summer in Montreal, associated with a university there. But there were usually 300-400 groups from all over Canada who were involved in various kinds of community development activities. And the guy who organized is a man named Lance Evoy. And one time I was there, he said, John, you see that guy over there? And he pointed to a guy who was balding, looking like he's 55. He says, he is Canada's greatest community developer. And you ought to go over and spend time with him. And I said, where is he? And he says, oh, he's the mayor of Amqui in the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. Does any of you ever heard of Amqui? It's so right in the middle of the Gaspé Peninsula. And it's not very big. I think it's got about 3,000 people. And so I introduced the mayor, and he said, come on up. Come on up, spend a couple days with me. Now he said it haltingly because I don't speak French, and he was not an ace at English. But we had a wonderful interaction. And so the first day I was there, we walked out of the city hall, small city hall, and two guys come up to him. And they talk to him in French, very good. He's talking. And then they go away, and I said, what happened? And he said, these two guys, we have these nets on the river up above town because the biggest industry in town is fishing for Atlantic salmon, brings in all the tourists, right? So these salmon are really important, and they have a net to keep the salmon from going too far, so they'll be accessible to the fishermen. And so they were saying there are poachers up there cutting holes in the net, and the salmon are getting through and escaping. And he said, and catch this, freeze it in your mind. He said, that's terrible. He said, what could be done about that? He says to these two. He's making them the problem solver. And so they give him 2 or 3 ideas. And then he says to them, well, if those are the things we need to do to deal with that, who do you know that would like to be involved in doing those things? Think about it. He says, and I want you to come to City Hall this evening in the council room and bring the people who want to do something about the problem you've identified, right? And you have the ideas about solving. Bring them. And so I went to that meeting, and there were about 8 people there, and they engaged in this long discussion in which all of them understood that they were the problem solvers of this problem. And at the end of the meeting, Gaston Rousse, the mayor, said to them, this is so important that I am making you the official salmon preservation committee for the city. And I want you to meet here in City Hall. I want you to be the authority. Right? And Lancy Boy was telling me, the man who organized the annual meetings, he said, if you could spend more time, John, he said, every single adult there is an official. Everyone. A productive citizen, a neighbor contributing. So I leave Gaston Rousse's ingenious message with you. He assumes that everybody there is a producer of a vision, a solution, and the action to make it come true. And it is the most vibrant community, I think, in all of Canada. And I get a small fee from the Tourist Bureau of Amqui to urge you to go up there and see it. So we're on a wonderful journey because most of the stuff we're talking about here isn't being done. So am I optimistic about the future? Oh, I'm more optimistic than I've ever been. I'm just sad that I'm 83 years of age. And I'm not going to be able to take this journey with you. But you have this wonderful, you're living in abundance of gifts and skills and passions and teaching ability. And it's all waiting for you to do the initiative, to begin to get it going. And Howard can tell you tomorrow how they've done that in Edmonton. Or, and I should say this, you can go to our website where we have a lot of tools about this way of doing things, and our website is simple, abcdinstitute.org. abcdinstitute.org. Look especially at a newer one called the Educating Community. We're interested in people who want to join us in beginning to think that the biggest asset undiscovered in every community is what people have to teach. And so we're beginning to get communities organized around that. If you're interested in that, send me an email. I'd love to have you in the movement that's being created. So, thanks so much. Boy, what a future you have. Wow.